Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to our NSCF webinar today that's going to be looking at GRAP 103. Thank you very much for joining us and thank you to our panelists who agreed to contribute to this webinar. Next slide. So I think to start off with, we're going to have an overview of the GRAP 103 accounting standards, and then we're going to have input from our panelists on their experience. And so at this point, I'll allow them to introduce themselves. So Liesel, can we start with you, please? Or Tertia?
I can go first. My name is Liesel Yugukutsia. I'm from the National Museum. And I was involved in the GRAP process in 2017-18. Thank you.
Thanks, Tertia.
Hello, my name is Tertia Perigal. I'm from Dutsong, and I've been also involved in GRAP 103 since 2016 till date.
Thank you. Ansa?
Hi everyone, my name is Ansa van Vuren. I'm the Senior Manager at the Campus for Plant Health and Protection of the Agricultural Research Council. And we house a large portion of the national collections.
Thank you. All right, so I'll just start off by giving some background for those people who've been involved in GRAP. This will all be well known to you, but we do have some people who haven't done GRAP 103 yet. Then we'll get input from our three panelists on their experience. And then we'll look at the questions that have come through and see if we can answer them as a panel. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the rules for, or guidelines for engagement. So you can contribute in the question, you can ask questions in the question and answer box. You can do that as we're going through the presentations, and you can use the chat box to say hello. People are doing that now. You can see who's here. Hopefully we'll be able to get through all the questions, but if we're not, we will find another way to answer them. I think that there will be quite a lot of questions. And yeah, we're very pleased to have from some of the institutions, the CFOs and people from finance and administration, and we really welcome you to this webinar and hope that it will be useful. All right, next slide. Okay, so GRAP, we often talk about GRAP, but it's a generally recognized accounting practice. And there are many, many of these different GRAPs, and they are applicable to all the public entities, whether you're national, provincial, or municipal. And according to the Public Finance Management Act of 1999, they require the Accounting Standards Board to develop the standards for the different GRAPs. They're GRAPs that deal with all kinds of different things. And that's what the Auditor General uses when they do the audit of your institution. So for most of us who work in the collections, we scientists or collection managers, and GRAP arrived and it created panic and fear and chaos and resulted in qualified audits for a lot of institutions. So institutions that had had clean audits for many years suddenly found themselves with qualified audits. And there's still some institutions that haven't been audited yet, but they will be soon. And so there are lots of questions and uncertainty around GRAP 103. And we were asked as the NSCF to have a workshop we were going to do it, but we've postponed that because of the lockdown, and we just decided now we couldn't wait any longer. We'll do it using a webinar. So GRAP 103 was actually, the first version was published in 2008, and it was supposed to become effective in 2012, but it was postponed until 2016-17 because the institution saw it as being complex. All right, next slide. So GRAP 103 deals with heritage assets, and these have cultural, environmental, historical, natural, scientific, technological, or artistic significance. And they are objects that are held indefinitely for the benefit of present and future generations. So they can't be consumed or used up. They have to be protected. So there's been some uncertainty about some of the natural science collections. Are they heritage assets? Do they meet this? We use them for research, we dissect them, we pull legs off, we cut bits off. And so are they heritage assets? And for a while I thought that they weren't, because they're not all of our collections are preserved indefinitely. Next slide. The other issue around being classified as a heritage asset is that it must be possible to reliably measure the cost or the fair value of the asset. So the cost is, what did you pay to acquire this asset? How much did you pay for it? And it's not the same as how much your field trip cost. It's what did you pay for it? And if you didn't pay anything for it, the other way you can look at it is the fair value. And that's the amount for which an asset could be exchanged. This is their definition: by a knowledgeable and willing buyer and seller in an arm's length exchange. So this is, if you put this object on the market, how much could you sell it for? So you in some cases you can get a valuator or somebody in the institution, but you would need to tell the auditor how you found that, how you got that value. If you can't determine a fair value and there isn't a cost, you didn't buy it, then the entity just needs to disclose relevant and useful information about the heritage asset in the notes in the financial statements. So this again comes from the GRAP 103 guidelines and from the actual document for GRAP 103. So you need to describe what have you got, how many have you got, why you can't value it, and whether you disposed of any items. So yeah, so the cost, you can't say that it's the cost incurred to collect a natural science specimen or sample, or to identify it or to prepare it. And you can't say that that it's a replacement cost, because replacement cost is only recognized for specialized or man-made objects. Cannot be for a natural science collection specimen that cannot be replaced. So for many of our collections, you didn't pay for them, and there's no market value for them. And so then the third thing is to disclose with the relevant information. Okay, next slide. So when I first read all of this, I got quite excited because I thought, okay, maybe we don't have to do GRAP 103 for natural science collections, because most of them can't be valued, and many of them are actually used for research. But then I realized in accounting standards, any asset needs to fall under some GRAP. So they're going to need to be registered somewhere. You're going to have your inventory. You're going to have to value them. There's GRAP 110, which is living and non-living resources. So that's like things like seeds and frozen tissues. There's GRAP 27, which is a lot of the agricultural assets. There's GRAP 17, which is property, plant and equipment, and that includes research materials. And so all of them are going to be audited. So there's no way to actually avoid accounting for your collections. And GRAP 103 is actually the best one for us because it allows you to not value the assets and just to disclose them. So it has a big advantage over the other GRAPs. Okay, next slide. So I looked into various things. This information I got from a parliamentary portfolio committee meeting that was held, I think, in 2017. And it had the Auditor General, it had the Accounting Standards Board, it had the DAC people and the Portfolio Committee. And there was a lot of controversy about whether GRAP 103 was right or wrong or what would happen. Anyway, so from the Auditor General, they said that they are open to getting input and to having guidelines developed for GRAP 103. They actually requested that DAC do research on and develop guidelines on the market values of different types of heritage assets, because they recognize that works of art are not the same as pinned insects or pickled fish or dried plants. They stated that the entities need to embrace the standards and demonstrate that all possible solutions have been considered when they disclose their heritage assets. So if you're not going to get a value on it, then I think we should also do some research. So look on the internet to see what, can you auction these? Is there a value for them? They also recognize that there are challenges of GRAP compliance so they had initially invested from National Treasury 200 million rand for the heritage institutions to become GRAP compliant. And that was a once-off investment. From now on, institutions are on their own and they have to comply using their normal budget and their normal capacity. And so they recognize that that may be a challenge. They also recognize the risks associated with insurance and theft. So once if you value your whole collection, then you've got to insure it for that value. And where do you get the funds to do that? And then also for some very valuable items, once you've got your inventory and you've disclosed it and you've put values against it, it increases the risk of theft of those very valuable items. They recognize those challenges. Next slide. And the Accounting Standards Board said, this is what we expect from institutions. We want them to identify their collections. So what collections do you have? Conduct physical stock take. So what have you got? How many of things have you got? Where are they? And then to repeat that stock take every 4 years. To have physical register for all the collections and to perform reconciliation of registers between stock takes. Conduct an assessment, so including assessment of subsequent acquisitions over that period. So what new have you got? Have you documented it? And then perform an assessment and account for damaged assets and convert the physical asset register to electronic asset registers. And upgrade these, procure necessary software and upgrade existing systems. So that's what they expect us to do. So when I read all of this, and I also realized that this is what the NSCF community have been working really hard at when they've developed the collection management and conservation manual. So that includes a whole lot of standards for your database, your register, for managing, organizing your collections, and keeping everything documented and having workflows and processes and policies. So if we implement that manual, we will reach a lot of compliance in terms of GRAP 103. So I'm just a theory person. I've never had to do any of this. And so I think at this point, we'll hand over to the experts who have been involved in implementing GRAP 103 and who've been through audit processes. So we're going to start with Tertia from Ditsong. So I'll hand over to you at this point. Thanks, Tusha.
Thank you, Michelle. Slide is just to give you an idea of the numbers we were working with when we started with the GRAP project. So at the time of disclosure, in the natural history collections, you can see, I'll touch on high value a bit later, but the total verified specimens. So what we did is we verified every single specimen we had on the floor. As you can see from the Coleoptera and the Lepidoptera collections, we really did count every single specimen, general entomology, ornithology, paleontology, herpetology. So the grand total for natural history was 2.4 million with change, and then high value was 82,000. Now, the next slide is how did we go about doing inventory at natural history? So vertebrate and invertebrate collections were verified exactly the same. We physically verified the items on the floor. The only difference is that invertebrate collections are not accessioned, but we had to disclose and recognize we have these items in our collection. We used a unique identification number in the database to identify the different specimens. And a little bit further on, I'll show you an example of a database. I pulled a sample out of the database for invertebrates. But it's got its location as far as we could gather information on species, name, localities, all of that. We gathered all that information, counted all the specimens. And then at the same time, we developed what we call the Heritage Asset Management Policy and the Heritage Asset Accounting Policy. The Heritage Asset Management Policy speaks to it's based on the guidelines from the NSCF, ICOM, and all the other international standards on the management of assets in museums. And we also brought in the GRAP compliance because, as Michelle stated, part of what the Accounting Standards Board requires is what we've been doing anyway. We also documented the processes. We developed templates for reporting to standardize it across the board. The location of specimens and other objects in the collections and their movement was guided by the International Guidelines for Museum Object Information. And from that, because of those guidelines, we developed movement forms for items in the collections. So movement forms are required for when we send specimens on loan, when we move for preparation. What we don't record are all the unprepared specimens, all the specimens we've gathered from the field, because we are not sure if we're going to retain them in the collection or not. Imagine if you reported to the auditors every single insect that came from a pit trap, and then you only selected a few. So all the unprepared specimens we haven't disclosed and we don't disclose. We'll tell them about and explain it to them, but we don't disclose them. So all the items that are in the collection are the ones that are recorded in movement forms on loan, for preparation, or for any other reason. The next slide is just an example of what our movement form is like. It's very basic. If it exists, it's a catalog number. The locality we speak of here is locality within the collection, not the locality where the specimen was collected. The reason for removal, where we've moved it to, moved by. Where we've moved, who moved it, and the date it was moved. As soon as the specimen is returned back into the collection, we then take this document and we file it. The reason is if the auditors do verification of existence in the collection, they pull samples out of the database. And if the item cannot be found in the collection, we then have to explain to them where that specimen is. So we just put this in the drawers, and it made life so much easier for us during the audit. The next slide, please. So this is a sample from the database for invertebrates. I took it out of Lepidoptera. So as you can see, there's a unique system ID. Under accession number, it says unaccessioned. The Lepidoptera types are accessioned, but those are the only invertebrates that I know of that are accessioned. Our former curator in general entomology, Audrey, did start accessioning the general entomology types. So we'll see if Dr. Bird will continue with that. And then item description, and what's important here is the floor and the location for auditing purposes. We don't quite specify exactly the cabinets and the drawers because of taxonomic changes, particularly in the invertebrate collections and the items being moved collection to collection. It's almost impossible to keep up with those changes. So what we decided to do is just to put the floor in the room. So in the Coleoptera collection, where the scarab beetles are, they'll probably move within the collection, but the chances of them moving to another room are not as high, and that would be much easier to control. You can see under quantity, what we did is we'll take a species, a series, and you'll see under species name, and then we just counted how many there were. So you'll see there was 136 in the first row, 260, 286. So what the auditors then do is, if they feel up to it, is they'll draw a species name, check how many are here under quantity, and then go sit there and count. So far, they haven't done that yet, but if they do, well, the specimens should all be there anyway. And you'll see it even lists what are the paratypes and the holotypes. Now, the reason why we list what is a paratype and a holotype is those are what we consider high value items. So because the materiality framework for every organization comes from the PFMA, and that lists what's of material value. So with the cultural objects, it's much easier because they've got a value to it, but we didn't value. So what we consider high value in the natural history collections are all the types, which is why then it lists there which ones are the types for the auditors and for obviously for our own control purposes. The next slide. So what we did while we were busy doing the verification and the inventories, we created an asset verification system, a database, to gather all that information. Now, the ideal, what we're working towards is to have all the natural history information just on Specify, so that for auditing, they use Specify. For all your collections management work, you'll use Specify. Right now, we're using the original old Access Excel databases. The collections that have already started moving to Specify using Specify and that asset verification system, which is currently a bit problematic. But the curators are working flat out to try and fix everything that we can so that we can then put everything into Specify, and that will become the single database we'll be using. What we realized with the verification and the audit is the more up-to-date your information is. So if you've got a complete policy, you have proper standard operating procedures, and you have proper business processes, you submit that to the auditors. It makes the audit so much easier. So I've added an example here of a simple, well, doesn't look very simple, but it is a simple business process for verification of assets. So the curators have this. So if they're unsure, they just follow this flow chart. And this is also what the auditors will follow, and then request the evidence as needed. Next slide. So valuation for natural history, none of our specimens were valued. And the reason why we didn't value, one of them is because there is no fair market trade in fossils and any other specimen. Costs, we couldn't validate costs. For most of them, either way, we don't know what it costs to retrieve the specimens. The other reason is we don't want to set a precedent. For the items that we could, the specimens that we could determine a fair market value, we don't really want to set a precedent by putting prices to natural history specimens. So at natural history, the only items that were valued were the Finch Davies paintings and the library collection. As I touched on, high value items that we listed for natural history, which the auditors wanted to know about, is we then told them the high value items are all our types, which we then annually, our policy then says, how do we verify types, high value items, what random verifications do we do, what do our verification reports contain, what is the evidence, all of that is listed in the policy, which then helps us as the staff and the auditors audit us based on that policy. Next slide. So as I said, the policy and the business processes, accessioning process in natural history is also listed on the policy because it became a bit problematic during audits. So what we require, there's three, most of the assets acquired by natural history, you have to disclose the new additions annually. But what we have is most of the items that are donated to the museum, we have to submit to the Collections Management Committee, and then the committee agrees on their accessioning or not. Do they fall within the gap analysis we did of our collections? Are they part of our accessioning strategy, which we created? Will we derive future benefit from them? Is there correct permits attached to them, provenance, all of that? So that is important for the Collections Committee to grant approval for donations. The exceptions that don't require approval are items that come through legal deposit, the material that comes through field work, because you intended to collect the item through your field work, and the field work being approved by management technically already grants approval for the items to be brought into the collection. And the other one is voucher specimens that are placed in the museum's collections as part of a scientific study. When the items are accessioned, the curators just have to be clear in their accessioning process that the item came via the following processes, which is why we didn't require approval. We realized that the targets in our annual performance plan, we verify high value items, and the technical indicator descriptors is very, very important because that is where we've had our fingers burnt during previous audits. During the audit of existence, what the auditors do is they do verification from the floor to the register, and from the register to the floor, which is that asset verification system I mentioned. The other thing we have to disclose is impairments, additions, and prior period error. With the impairments, that is any items that are damaged and any specimens that have been approved for destructive sampling. We then list in the impairment list, and that's how we get around that whole process. Since they've all been disclosed as heritage assets, we also then have to disclose if there's been changes to the asset, if it's been completely destroyed or whatnot. We submit an impairment report on an annual basis, which then is audited. Next slide. So this is the other thing that has saved us is we created an audit checklist. So for every process that you do in your collection, this is the evidence that you should have as a curator, as anyone working in the collections. This is just a piece of the audit checklist. It's actually a little bit longer, but it's just to give you an idea. This has also helped us get our evidence all right already. So we share this audit checklist with the auditors, and we make sure that all the evidence is there, which has made for a much smoother audit process. So as you can see with accessioning for new or accession loans outside of South Africa, we have the loan request, the loan form, the SARA permits if relevant, movement forms, condition reports. We also require any relevant top society permits and all the other legal requirements. So every curator has this on hand, so that at first it's a very slow, cumbersome process, but once you get into the swing of things, this is what's helped us go from adverse to qualified, unqualified, and clean eventually. The next slide, please. So the biggest lessons that we have learned during this whole auditing and GRAP 103 process is, number one, change management and consultation and buy-in is extremely vital. Some curators became quite defensive, thinking we're going to come in and expose and point fingers and say, but you weren't doing things right, you didn't do things right. So you have to constantly engage change management, get their buy-in, explain that this is for compliance, this is for the good of the organization. All we're technically doing, and we were doing, is to just formalize processes that have been in existence in a very long time. So we're bringing in consistency in the way we report across all the museums, which makes for the audit also much, much easier. If we're working off a standard template, the evidence that you submit is part of the template, and it makes the audit much easier. And when you have a buy-in from the curators, they hide less things. So everyone is in it. Curators, because of the buy-in we had from the curators, they went above and beyond to try and get us through this whole process. Knowledge management and documentation is extremely vital. As you can see, there's a lot of documentation and papers and reports involved with the process. Keeping track of it is extremely important. Making sure that the policies, standard operating procedures and business processes are up to date or detailed help us a lot. They might also catch you out upon occasion, but anyway, the audit is there to pick up any loopholes or any issues that might arise. The mistake we made is we rushed the process. We had 6 months to do all of that, to verify all those items, value, and it caused problems. Items were missed, which is why we have to now disclose prior period error. Spelling descriptions were really messy. Most of them are rubbish. You can't even use them. Locations aren't quite correct, so we're spending time fixing it. Take a hit on an audit. What we have realized and we've admitted is we should have taken another negative audit outcome, accepted it, and taken the time to fix the process. The other mistake we made is we didn't reconcile the catalog books and the accession registers to the verifications in the databases, which we had to do subsequently. And from that, we created a lost items list, which we now have 5 years to verify. Are the items, in fact, technically really lost? Are they on loan? Are they misplaced? And then after the 5 years, we'll then revisit the lists and see what needs to possibly be submitted to the Minister for deaccessioning or what is being accounted for. The location of assets on the floor must be correct. That is usually where we get caught out by the auditors. And even in this financial year, it was an audit finding. Having a person to champion or to coordinate, to be the central person to carry the GRAP 103 process is vital, because there's a lot of information, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of documentation needs to be done, and having a central person to drive that process makes for much easier reporting from top down and from down up. And it's not a perfect process. We're still sitting with a lot of issues, but at least now we know we are in a better position than what we were, and we're just working to fix everything that needs to be fixed. The other thing we've learned is to engage with the AGSA during the audit. They're also not too sure of the processes. They don't understand always what we do. So if you take the time to explain to them and show them, such as with in invertebrates, we've created a little audit file that explains to every new auditing team why we don't accession our invertebrate collection, why we do things the way we do. We give them that file with the policies, the procedures, and it makes for a much smoother auditing process. The other thing we've always had issues with is regards to the ownership of assets. The last few audits, what we've submitted is a letter that states that refers them to the Cultural Institutions Act and the National Heritage Resources Act as to why we claim ownership of these assets, and they seem to be quite satisfied with that. And that brings me to the end. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tertia. We'll now ask Liesel from the National Museum.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Okay, so I'm from the National Museum in Bloemfontein. I don't have nearly as much knowledge as Tertia, but I will explain what we did in the 2017-18 audit at the National Museum. Okay, so the National Museum got the money from Treasury, from DAC, for implementation of GRAP 103, because for a few years we got a qualified audit due to not implementing, and then the new CFO we got in 2017 just said, now enough is enough. We put out a bid and we got the service provider to do it for us. So there was not really much time. The service provider was appointed from 1 December to 20 April. And just keep in mind, there's also a holiday in there somewhere. And they had to have everything ready by the time of the financial statements in May 2018. So it was kind of a hurried process, and we didn't really have time to prepare. But in the end, we got the unqualified audit we wanted. So at the end of 2017, the museum had almost 700,000 assets, which include both heritage and non-heritage assets of art, books, natural sciences, and human sciences. As you can see here, the natural sciences at that time were about 530,000 specimens, not nearly as much as the song had. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So the scope of the work for the service provider was to confirm if the heritage assets identified meet the definition in line with GRAP 103. They had to value those heritage assets. They provide assumptions and evidence for the valued assets, provide evidence of a legal market or not, and then recommend the appropriate subsequent measurements, and then also assist during the audit and help with queries to the Auditor General. Part of the scope was also to transfer skills on how to value heritage assets, which was a continuing process. I don't think we can do it ourselves yet, but at least we know the process and how it works. So as you can see, verification was not really part of the scope, but it was included in some ways by the service provider. Next slide. So for valuation, our natural science collections met the definition of heritage asset as they are controlled by the museum and offer scientific research value to other institutions, students, and thus bring service benefits to the museum. The natural sciences collections were declared as heritage assets and mostly with zero monetary value, because most of them has a total absence of legal market, and neither cost nor the fair value of the collection could be reliably measured. We also had property, plant and equipment, some items. For example, mostly in the exhibitions, for example, we have a big cast of an elephant or of the rhinoceros, and that was valued as PPE. Okay, next slide. So these are the collections we have. So as you can see, most of them, every one of them was heritage assets, and then all of them doesn't have a legal market except for mammalogy and ornithology. We valued the taxidermy specimens, and we also have a small shell collection of about 250 shells on exhibition, and they were all valued. For supporting evidence, there's many laws that governs this, but also we got a letter from Sanby stating there's no legal market, and then also the AG required a letter from the expert scientists in each department, in each collection, to state that there's no legal market. As he said, the scientists are actually the experts. They will know if there's a legal market or not. Okay, next slide. So here's just some pictures. For example, the taxidermy specimens, some of them are in the exhibitions. They were valued, the shells, and then not valued with the other exhibitions like plants, stuffed birds, and entomology. They were not valued. Okay, next slide. So for the verification process, as I said, there was not really enough time, and the collection managers were not prepared. It's like we didn't prepare like few years in advance for this GRAP implementation. So the service providers got the asset registers or got the databases from each collection and converted it into asset register. Each item got a unique global ID. So we provide our databases in Excel, Access, and Proms, and they converted everything to Excel. They took the location as per the store or the room, for example, herbarium, the paleontology store, entomology store, which makes it easier if you move items in the store. For example, entomology, the insects often changes names or placement, then you can still move it around. So the verification for the collections, acarology, arachnology, botany, entomology, and herpetology was verified by family. So they created a parent asset, which was the family, and then linked all the items, all the specimens from that family to the parent. So for example, acarology, we had 266 families, and they were all verified, and photos were taken of them. A problem if the collection is not verified by the collection manager is, for example, one of the families was missing, and of course I couldn't identify it, I couldn't check it because it was missing, and probably it was wrongly identified because it's not a family that occurred in South Africa anyway. Okay, then mammalogy and ornithology, they were also verified per family, and the taxidermy specimens were all verified and valued individually. For Floris Bud, the human remains were all verified, and then the mammal remains were verified per family. Paleontology and geology, some minerals were valued and verified, and then some fossils were verified. Seems like it was like a random verification. And then, of course, as I said, the shell collection, everything was valued and verified. So since the GRAP process, all the collections embarked on a full verification audit of the collections, and it was recommended by the service provider. Some of them are done, and some of them are still busy. Okay, next slide. So we've written a policy with the help of the Tsong Museum. So initial measurement, if the heritage asset that qualifies for recognition shall be measured at its cost, or in the case of most natural history collections, at zero cost. And then we also have the revelation model, subsequent measurement. There's two models, the cost model and the revelation model. So the cost model, when a cost model is used, heritage assets are carried at cost, less any impairment or losses. And the revelation model, for example, some heritage assets experience significantly and volatile changes in the fair value, and thus a revaluation is needed after a certain period. So the museum, we elected to have like a hybrid system. The cost model will be applied to natural sciences, cultural history, and library books, and the revaluation model will only be applied to the artworks for every 3 years. Next slide. So in my experience is that a standard is needed. It seems all the museums are doing it differently, and in a way everyone or most of them gets an unqualified audit. So it seems like there's not really a standard. As Tertia also said, there's time constraints. It's really, I think it was kind of a rushed process, and therefore we embarked on a full verification of all the assets. The way the service provider done the verification by the family, I think we found an acceptable way. The AG accepted that way. Then the CFO or champion has to be very much involved. Our CFO at the time was there every step of the way. She was fighting with the service provider, giving them headaches just to get everything right. And in the end, we succeeded. It seems like the service provider worked with Excel sheets, and no special software was required by the service provider or by the AG. And since then, the new additions are put in the asset register, which is in Excel. As yet, we don't have any formal asset movement form. Each collection is responsible to keep track of asset movement by indicating it on their database, being it like on a loan or maybe move to the office, must be indicated on the database. And that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. The next presenter is Ansa from the ARC.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the colleagues. It's really interesting listening to this, and I think we are here to learn from each other, and there is certainly a lot to take home. So I asked feedback from all the collection managers at our campus. So fortunately, most of them have logged in. So if you have any questions, that will be for them. And I think the CFO is also online. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit of our journey at the ARC and where we are now and the way forward. Next slide, please. So this is just to give you an idea of our timeline in terms of our involvement and busyness with this process, which started in August 2019 when I was made aware of the Natural Science Collection Facility Norms and Standards, and I started participating in the meeting with the collection managers, which was fascinating, and they've done such a good job on it. Based on our audit outcome, the ARC's audit outcome in the previous financial year, not, well, 2 years ago, the CFO called a biological assets meeting in September 2019, and I grabbed the opportunity to sort of display a lot of the collections that we do or that we have. And then we started from there, we started with our own internal processes, because the Auditor General focused very much on GRAP 27, the biological assets previously. And so we brought this whole concept of the national collections and the heritage assets to the fore. And so we then embarked on a process of audit readiness or preparedness internally. So a couple of meetings were held and workshops, and there was an engagement with the Auditor General. And then we also, in a way to assist ourselves, pretended to do our own audit. So myself and one of the research team manager pretended to be auditors, and we walked in from a beginner's mind, and we asked questions as if we have never been there. And subsequent to that, we then had COVID, which was for us, in a way, an opportunity to address certain things, and I will talk about that a little bit later. And I also engaged with the CFO prior to this meeting to get some feedback from her on the last year's audit outcome. So next slide, please. So this is just to give you an idea of the volume and the quantities and the variation, the diversity. So as you can see, we fall both into the platforms of GRAP 103 and GRAP 27, because we have living and non-living collections, if I can put it that way, and particularly in the fungi collection and bacteria. And this is just to give you an idea of the age and how long they are, how long they've been in existence, as well as the size of them. Next slide, please. So the collection managers gave me excellent reports, but they were really long, and I have them here with me. But what I tried to do is just capture a little bit of the visually. So this is one specimen room for spiders that we visited during our mock audit just before lockdown, and this is a picture of what it looks like now. And this is just in one of the collections. So all of the collections have been really, really hard at work, sorting, labeling, curating, getting their books up to date. And so I just captured the highlights here. I mean, there's a lot more than what they did, than what I put down here on the slide. But this is sort of what, and we so yeah, I agree, Ian. That is a big improvement. So they've worked really hard at that, and because they also work with like the fungal strains are stored in so many different ways. You know, they're in freezers and they are on agar, and there's a dried collection. So it's all those little dimensions that's also part of it. Next slide, please. So these are just some of our common challenges and outcomes that was identified by the collection managers, and I pulled the most common ones out. Documentation, poor quality and misplaced specimens and slides. You know, scientists use the specimens, and so we would walk as mock auditors, we would walk into an office and there would be a tray of specimen next to the person while that person is working on it, and we said, okay, now I'm an auditor, you know, how can I verify this? So that was a key thing that we picked up. Taxonomic changes not updated in the older records, discrepancies between physical specimens and database information. With the freeze-dried cultures, sort of a reciprocal problem where there would be a culture with no information or a number with no, or a culture with numbers that were not recorded. All of them said that this is really a time-consuming process. Some collections do not have a dedicated taxonomist to assist. In some cases, lack of proper databasing, also the mix between Access, Excel, and Specify. And something that was very key that we've identified, and it was a good learning actually, is that we have a very formal handover process during an exit interview when staff retire or resign. But what was not included in the specifically related to National Collection, you know, there's the giving back of a laptop and the handing over of the office keys, but handing over the collection physically, you know, to say, here's the accession books, here are the catalogs, here, and that verification process. We've actually built that into our HR processes, and of course, a lack of capacity. So the mock audit was really useful. Most of them said it was useful, and I think it was done in a good spirit. So labeling of specimens that were in the process of curation, that was something that came out and say, well, I'm busy working with it, yes, but you know, identify that. Standardizing on color coding, specimen rooms that were sorted into lots, labeled, and inventory, massive amount of work. And uncurated lots that were also being addressed. Next slide, please. So the positive things that came out for us and the learnings is we found new specimens, and this is an excerpt from our newsletter that is coming out in December. Our collections manager in nematology found quite valuable slides that were discovered in a cabinet, and what makes them valuable is that the species on there was the first plant parasitic nematode species described in South Africa. So she's in the process of incorporating that into the collection. So that was quite a find and a highlight for us. A lot of SOPs and policies have been drafted and is being tested out at the moment. Floor plans were drawn up. Laminated, placed on the doors, on all the cabinets. There's a plan to say what's in the cabinet, a form to say what's in the cabinet. Loan books have been updated. Donated specimens that were uncurated, maybe as to date, is being put into the collections. And what is really helpful, almost everyone identified that as well, is that it's highlighted knowledge gaps, like areas, either locations where collections have not been made in South Africa, or where we have gaps. And I think going forward for projects such as the National Biodiversity Assessment, I think this is really valuable. I already spoke about the handover process. Of course, the data now will become a lot more accessible because we're standardizing on it. and the fact that staff really took to this, and we could see in the feedback that I got from the collections managers that there was really staff development. You know, some staff were really thrown into the deep end, and they rose to the occasion, and they really owned the process. And yeah, we need to honor that as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just, I put this in because I thought it was such a good balance to the negativity of COVID. This is the team that we fondly refer to as the A team. These staff have absolutely no collections experience. They actually come from a unit in our campus called Insect Ecology and Pesticide Science Technology. And because of, in the initial stages of COVID, when there were provincial lockdowns, they couldn't travel. So they couldn't, where they would usually be utilized was in going to do trial work, and they couldn't do that. So we utilize them in the, and we call them the A team because they are so versatile and they just make things happen. So this is Magda and Ezekiel and Piet and Joel, and they, from August to mid-October, yeah, that's almost eight weeks, more than 8 weeks, did approximately 7,500 entries, draws, shells, microscopes, slide boxes captured and transcribed onto spreadsheets in the entomology team. And they just, because entomology is so large and so complicated, and I think very few, maybe not everyone knows that, but very only the specimens that have been worked on, that have been used in taxonomic studies, are catalogued. And so these guys really pushed they're back into the field now, because as you can see, Magda is in a maize field that's sadly overgrown with wheat, but they really helped to get the momentum going in our entomology unit, for which we are very grateful. Next slide, please. So just on the valuation, when we had the engagement with the CFO, oops, sorry about that. When we had the engagement with the CFO, I found this article about valuation that was done at the Museum of Texas Tech University, where they actually did use collection cost and curation cost to value the collections. And it was really interesting because they had to go through a similar exercise, and that's what they came up with. And when the question was asked internally, how would you value your collection? Most of the collection managers said, well, how about the selling price of cultures? And then we got to, you know, astronomical figures, but that's certainly one thought process. But when I spoke to the CFO, she had a different approach. Next slide, please. So this was fascinating for me when I spoke to the CFO, and she gave me feedback on the auditor's findings in terms of the biological assets, because as the ARC we have living assets and animals, and a lot of vineyards and trees and fruit orchards, etc. So in my mind, you know, and I think in most minds scientifically, qualitative means when you do a qualitative valuation, it's where you put a value like 1, 2, 3, 4, whereas quantitative is usually progressive and not well defined. In accounting, the terms are used differently. So in accounting, qualitative is a narrative when you do a qualitative disclosure, and quantitative is financial. And I thought that was fascinating. So she shared with me, this is an excerpt from our from the report from the AG that comes that's in our annual report, on how they approached, based on their experiences with the biological assets, how they approached the heritage assets, and they sort of grouped the gene banks together with the insect collections. And that they also, you know, when they looked at the uniqueness of the gene banks, that a fair value couldn't be determined, or replacement cost. But that going forward, that the valuation, the value would be based on what it would cost to maintain. So her advice for us was to continue with the mock audits, obviously continue with that process of cleaning up the collections, but at the same time create a dedicated system whereby we deposit all invoices and supportive paperwork relating to the upkeep or the maintenance of those of the collections. So in our case, it would be maintaining the fire sprinkler system, etc., and that would be the way forward for us. And I think that was my last slide, if I'm not mistaken. Just check. Next slide. Yes, that was so. Thank you for that, and thank you for for all the colleagues that are participating, because I think we're in this together. The one thing that I did find from my experience with the auditing process generally is that you never get the same set of auditors, and they have different kinds of interpretations. So it's not to say that the way that this set of auditors see it will be the same as the next one. And I thought that was something that was quite interesting. So thank you. That's me all done.
Okay, thanks very much. I think it gives quite a different perspective. You have sort of living collections, different types of collections. Okay, so there are some questions. So I just wanted to find out as well for Tertia, and I think it's relevant for people who have large collections of invertebrates, where you have each one with its own unique number. And what you've done is you said that you've got them in a spreadsheet, and each one has a unique number in the.
No, the species name.
The species name. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. So it's just a number. It'll just be a count of specimens, but not each one identified.
No, that will be a little bit difficult. So the species name had the number, but it's a system number, so it's not an accession number. And then each species had its number, and then the total count within that species, where possible.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Tertia. And then for Liesel, I just wanted to find out, and maybe people like CFOs who are part of us who have joined us can help with this. So do you have to do the valuation process if there's no cost or no fair value to an item?
Sorry, you broke up a bit. Just ask the question again.
Okay, so do you have to do the revaluation if there's no cost or no fair value? So how can you do a revaluation? You said there's no cost.
Yeah, so the reevaluation is only for artwork. It's not for natural science collections, only for artwork.
Okay, all right. Thank you for clarifying that. Okay, so let's just look. So Ian asked, are there any key differences between GRAP requirements and having a good database and collections management practices, such as loans and recording the storage in place that we need to be aware of? So maybe from your perspective, is there anything that our current practice of, and I don't know how much of the manual that the Natural Science Collection Facility collection management manual you've seen, but is there anything that you think, any of you, that sticks out as being something that we would have to implement in addition to what we normally do? We probably haven't covered audits in our manual. So that verification process and auditing in our own audits that we should do at certain intervals. Tertia?
Actually, basically what GRAP requires, except for the valuations, is what we do every day. So I can't think of, okay, maybe with impairments, it would be, but outside of that, no.
Okay. Okay, all right. So it seems like it's more or less what we do anyway. So there were some questions from Helen. So she asked, okay, so she asked about who are these auditors? Who are the auditors? So this is the Auditor General's office. So they, so everybody who falls under the PFMA has an audit. Every year they come, they send them from the Auditor General South Africa's office, and they come and they spend weeks, sometimes months, and they check every single thing. And we don't know who they are, but they're from the Auditor General's office. And that was an important point that ANSA made, was that whoever comes changes every year. And it's also come up before that, I mean, every province seems to have a different set of auditors, and they sometimes have different interpretations and different understandings. And I think that's why a set of guidelines would be useful for us to document what we, you know, from based on the experiences. So just because you've got a clean audit this year doesn't necessarily mean you'll get it the next year. Even though you're doing everything the same, they may find something that they didn't pick up, that the others didn't pick up the previous year. Okay, so it can be very complicated. And then Helen said she asked about the library holdings. And so, yeah, Tertia, maybe you can answer. So how do you define heritage assets in terms of library holdings? How do you distinguish that from ordinary books?
It was actually the National Library just went through that exact same process, because they had to determine, they also have to do GRAP now as well. So we were having a discussion about what constitutes heritage assets with regards to library and what is PPE. So what we did is anything that's Afrikaner, that's considered Afrikaner. So Afrikaner is any book published about or on South Africa or in South Africa that's older than 60 years is Afrikaner. So that became heritage asset. And then there are books of exceptional value. I mean, our library has first edition Linnaeus. It would stand to reason that it would be a heritage asset. So it's difficult at first. So what we did is the really old books, Afrikaner, the really valuable, and curators were actually quite important with regards to this, because they could also, their input is valuable. I mean, what are the most important and seminal works that you refer to every day that is really, really important? That became heritage assets. Dictionaries, everyday works, not necessarily. So it was a long process to determine, but what we did is we disclosed every single book in the library, but only valued those that are heritage. We didn't want to go the PPE route with that, because we foresaw that there would be difficult and negative audit outcomes in future, because obviously library books are types of items that easily disappear.
Okay, all right, thanks very much, Tisha. Okay, so let's just see. Libraries. So Ian also says specify actually supports collection audits. But Brahms doesn't seem to. So for the herbarium specimens, they don't have that so easily. And then Pumlani has asked, what is the danger of not using the current produced NSCF accession register? So I don't think for the audit it's that. So yeah, so what do they, you know, like, how do you prove that these items actually came into the institution? So if you put them into a database, anybody can delete them and remove those objects. So how do you prove, how do you have a permanent record of acquisitions or new items coming in?
So Michelle, I think Roger also had a question. Roger, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, obviously we've got something like 1 million fish that when we put them back onto the shelves, hopefully they go into the right place. We've got a procedure to do that, and most of our staff are, you know, are good at it. But it's impossible for us to ensure that that is done perfectly, and over time, obviously, that amounts to lots of specimens being out of place. I'm sure the same thing happens in other museums, and you know, whilst I think we're fairly well run, I'm pretty sure we can never ensure that all our specimens are in the right place. And I'm just wondering how much of an issue that is going to be.
Okay, all right, thanks, Roger. So, so can we just go back to that permanent record of your assets? I mean, how do you, I don't know how the auditors treat it in terms of, you know, an electronic record can very easily be deleted.
Yeah,
And
we
so
only have electronic records. We don't have any paper records.
Yeah. So it seems like there isn't. So the NSCF requirement is that there is an accession register. It's a handwritten entry for each object or lot, and that's because it can't be tampered with. It's a permanent record of new items that come into the collection, and that's required. It hasn't been required so much by the auditor, but I think it's a matter of time before they pick up on this, that you can delete entries in a database. And so who's to say somebody didn't steal all your rhino horns and delete it from the record, and there's no record of that ever having existed. You know, so before, they may just actually pick that up as being a flaw in the process.
Okay, but that's a different issue to what I'm asking about. I'm asking about.
I know. So Pumlani
locating, yeah.
In the questions there. Okay, so Ian says it would be in the database backups. Okay, so if you could produce your backups that were deposited in a repository, that were dated, that were secured, that nobody could tamper with, then maybe if you had blockchain, it would be fine. If anybody can access those databases, then it's not fine, because you can go back and tamper however many going back. Okay, so Loki says not if the records were shared the previous year. Okay, so yeah, so you can see we're going to have to wrap our heads around this inventory and electronic records. So to come back to Roger's question about, you know, specimens are going to move. We take them out, we work on them, we put them back, they come back from a loan. How do you always put them back in the same place? And I think both Liesel and Tertia explained that they only use the room number. Yeah? Sometimes the cabinet number, but they can't really have like a very specific locality. And I think the room number is probably a good idea, or your rack, your row of shelf numbers, you know, so you can track it to some extent, but it's not that specific.
Yeah, but so the issue for me is that we do that. We don't locate the exact position. We know we label our shelves, and we know a particular family or a genus is on one shelf, and we can go and find that. But if the auditor was to ask us for a specimen, we would have to then go and find it. And if the specimen hasn't been put back in the right place, we won't find it. And that's the problem. And I'm sure other museums have the same issue.
Yeah, so I think that we have to, that's where that movement, that specimen movement sheet is so important. So when you take something off the shelf, you put a slip of paper to say, I've taken this from there. When it goes back, it goes into the same
Oh, it
place.
goes on the it goes on the shelf. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So when you take something out, you put that little slip, and I think Tertia showed an example of it. It looked very useful to have that. Okay, so people are asking about that register, that accession register. I see Hester's also asked some questions about it. So the permanent record is also a requirement for all your CITES material. And that's required by CITES. So if you registered as a CITES institution, they will want to see that you keep a permanent register of all accessions, because it means that, again, it can't be tampered with. And so if you haven't, I know a lot of institutions move towards using only their database. And we had long debates about this when the working group was doing the manual. People said, we haven't used it for ages, we can't anymore, we just capture things into our database. And we've made some recommendations about it. Basically, then you must print out your database, your new accessions must be printed out every year and signed off and verified by somebody and filed in a way that you can't lose that page. So whether it's bound in a hardbound book, but that's what CITES are wanting. They want something where you can't delete, you can't rip out, you can't scratch out, there has to be that permanent record. Okay, so let me just see. There were some other questions. Okay, if items are removed from the herbarium temporarily and taken to an office, do we need to keep formal record? So any of the panelists who've got experience in this? How do you handle when staff, like Ansa was saying, when she did her walk around, she found collections, you know, so a scientist on their desk, there's some specimens that they're working with. Should they, even if they've just taken it out for a few hours, do they need to record that somewhere?
So the way they explained it to me, the ones that they worked on was not, they didn't take it out for a few hours. They would take it out for long periods, and then they would have like a placeholder where they took it out. The biggest issue was that even if, for me, it was not so much the fact that they were moving it, but it was if they were working on something that has not yet been catalogued or curated, is just to sort it into lots. That was almost a bigger problem or issue, if I can say that. So in other words, going there and working on something was less of the issue, taking something out, than having stuff with you, specimens that have not yet been put in the collections, and then you sit with this maybe identified but uncatalogued lot. And we made a provision for that, to say, have a book for it, say it's, you know, you're working on it, give it a lot number, and just say what it is. So that was almost the problem, or the challenge was more on that side, if I can give that feedback.
Okay. So I think that it is good practice when you remove anything from the collection to put a slip there to say, I've taken this out of the collection. Because otherwise, you know, there's no record of who's taken things out, even if it is for just a few hours. The next thing, you find things that you want to carry on working, weeks go by, months go by, there's another lockdown, that stuff is still sitting there, you forget about it. And so it actually is good practice every time you take even one specimen out of the collection and away from the room, to just fill in one of those slips of paper and put it in there. Okay, so Tertia's explained what they do. They download all their digital registers on the final day of the financial year, save them. Okay, all right. Yeah, okay. So you'd have to save them onto something that is a permanent, it's a permanent record. Okay, let me just check that there's, okay, so for loan specimens, we can use movement slips. The specimens could be returned correctly. However, newly catalogued materials coming into the collection could be misplaced. So if you don't find a specimen when they do the audit, what do they do, Tisha?
They end up, it's actually a very serious thing, because then they can't you've technically lost a heritage asset. So it's very serious. You end up with a negative audit outcome. Then they question the completeness of your register, and then they actually go and, oh, the CFOs will know, they go and create a projection of in total what would probably be missing, and then that could result in a material finding. So audit wise, not finding a specimen is very, very serious.
Yeah, it's like losing a car or,
Exactly.
you know, or a computer. It's the same, but it's even more valuable because it can't be replaced. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me just check that there aren't any other questions. Yeah, so Helen asked, is it the same auditor that does our financial audits? My understanding is yes, it is. It's part of the audit, the annual audit process. So it's the same people, and they often don't understand about collections. And I think Tertia said that they've learned that you must spend time with them and engage with them and show them, explain to them. I think that would help. So basically, this isn't, you know, yeah, you can't pick and choose whether you want to comply with GRAP or not. I think people have said, no, well, we actually would rather not do GRAP 103. It's too complicated. But I think that we don't actually have a choice if we've got natural science collections or anything that fits the definition even broadly of a heritage asset. At SANBI, the auditors haven't really looked at it that strictly, but I know that there's been no value put on the herbarium specimens, and they are declared or disclosed. And we haven't had problems. Okay, so I think that was very interesting, very relevant, and it relates to it's not just, this isn't just an audit thing. This is a lot about the work that we do and taking care of these collections and being accountable and being professional and looking after them, being responsible. And so this isn't something in addition to the work that we do. This is part of the work that we do. It just came as a shock to us, I think, and having to deal with concepts and terms that are for accountants. That was a bit of a challenge to us. Okay, so if there are other questions, you're welcome to feed them through either to Fulu or to me, and we can pass them on, or contact Tertia or Liesel or answer directly. The NSCF, we're a network, we work together, we help each other, and that's what we're here for. So I'd really like to thank the three people who gave time to put together the presentations. I think it was very valuable to hear from you, and we'll still learn more from you. And thank you to Fulu for setting up the webinar and for Chanel helping us run it. We will make, the presentations will be available somewhere. So this whole thing will be streamed somewhere, I don't know, it's Chanel or Fulu can answer. But yeah, they will be available. Okay, there Fulu says the recording will be on YouTube and on Facebook. So you will be able to show them to other people who couldn't make it today. So with that, thank you everybody. Yes, I hope it was worthwhile and that you learned a lot. Thank you.